Lightning Man by Richard L. Elsliger. Another storm is rolling in as I write these words. I always become apprehensive when I hear low rumbles in the distance. My first fears for such meteorological conditions started when my grandfather told me stories during those lazy summers spent at his cabin. I shall never forget the day he died when I was 13 years old. My grandfather was buried on a hot Saturday afternoon. Being a new teenager was not enough to prepare me for a full understanding of death on any level, the permanence of it, the finality, and the loss. That day, a humid pall hung over the cemetery. I remember traveling behind the hearse on a circuitous pebble road inside the grounds. We traveled at a lethargic pace, my dad following directly behind the yellow flashing overhead lights of the hearse, like a racer might follow a pace car, winding along an open track, waiting for something to happen. I was close to my grandfather. My parents liked to vacation together, and being the only child, I only got in their way when school ended and summer began. They left me with my grandpa as a consequence, and I would spend the summers with him, and he would take me fishing and hiking in the woods. I learned the Swedish language from him, the language passed down to me from his Swedish heritage, and he told a good many stories on the boat, stories that no one ever told me, haunting stories of the past, and stories from the old Norse world. That is when he first told me about the Lightning Man. Grandpa expressed an interest in the paranormal, but he kept a healthy skepticism. He mentored me and shared his philosophy of the world, bringing some of the ancient ways with him to the new world, which by degrees I better understood once I became older. I asked him one day about the afterlife, and he expressed his doubts about such things but kept an open mind. He always said the proof was in the event, and in the end we would all have our answer to this eternal question. He told me no religion had adequate explanations of the beyond, if indeed the beyond existed, and he said one might just as likely go to Valhalla than heaven, both concepts competing for legitimacy on an equal footing in his mind. Now my grandfather had his answer. At the ceremony, I stood by his graveside, looking at the mountainous pile of earth next to the deep hole. The pallbearers brought his casket to the burial spot, and the pastor commenced his sermon. I stood in a daze, the pastor's words passing over my grandfather's casket and scarcely registering in my head. The words felt blank and empty to me, for they could not bring my grandfather back. A cold and empty feeling overtook me in the summer heat, and I began to sob. The ceremony soon ended, and we were headed home. I remained silent in the back seat, and my parents spoke very little to each other according to my best recollection. I think my father suffered in his own way, choosing not to reveal his true feelings for losing his father under such sudden circumstances. We arrived home late in the afternoon, the persistent humidity assaulting and drenching our clothes. I am always keenly aware of humidity these days as a precursor to things more foreboding. I trailed behind my parents, and when I entered the front door, I went directly to my room on the second floor and stared out my window, watching the occasional car pass by. My mind remained in a profound state of loss at the realization that I would never see my grandfather again. My mother called me down for dinner, and we ate together at the table. My dad told me to stay strong, that it was all part of life and freakish accidents can happen to anyone at any time. I told my father that I understood, but it still hurt to lose Grandpa. My dad agreed, and for the first time, I saw tears streaming down my father's cheeks. It was a tough time at the dinner table, and I asked to be excused. I took my meal upstairs and turned on the weather report. Apparently severe thunderstorms were moving in toward evening, and to brace for heavy rainfall with periods of flooding. This news terrified me. I played computer games and in between took half-hearted bites from my plate, saddened by the day. The time went fast, and when I checked outside my window, the streetlight switched on and I heard rumbling beyond my window. I sat on my bed and watched the storm roll in, fearful of the lightning and fully aware of the danger for being outdoors in such inclement situations. It was lightning that killed my grandfather. Grandpa told me many stories over the summers I spent with him, but the most telling and frightful story was that of the Lightning Man, a name I created to explain the inexplicable. My grandfather spent his formative years growing up in Sweden and had a best friend whom he lost to a lightning strike. Grandpa, a man of science but also a man of superstition, told me the story of how his friend died in one spontaneous strike of electricity. It wasn't an ordinary bolt of lightning either, if lightning itself could ever be considered ordinary. Since my grandfather's death, I considered lightning to be quite extraordinary. Grandpa had told me that our ancestors from many generations before had given up the old ways, so he didn't believe in legends anymore, but with a few exceptions. For him there was no Odin and no Thor, the god of thunder. Those were made-up tales to explain what our distant ancestors could not explain through principles of science. One belief that did persist in my grandpa was the threat of the lightning man. He told me one summer day that the lightning man was a seldom told story and virtually unknown entity from the old myths of Norse religion. He told me one summer day that the lightning man was a seldom told story and a virtually unknown entity from the old myths of Norse religion. So old, in fact, that very few knew about the lightning man other than those who still followed the old ways. It was the lightning man, he said, that killed his best friend, Sven. The lightning man was more than just an old legend, an old tale of yore. It was an energy being, a terrible form that shot massive sparks of electricity with infallible accuracy and frightful lethality. The thing possessed a killer instinct, and Grandpa described the entity as a ball of energy that took on a partial human form just before it struck and killed. He told me this entity thrived in thunderstorms, and its appearance was preceded by intense levels of humidity. The thing could materialize without notice, and as fast as it appeared, you were dead. The lightning man appeared from nowhere one day, taking his friend while they camped deep within a Swedish alpine forest. Grandpa told me that Sweden was not known for its electrical storms, but when they did happen, they wielded their power with tremendous and fearsome force. My grandfather was but a young man when he and his friend Sven mapped out their journey and headed for the pine forest situated in the deep interior of the country. When they arrived to the forest, my grandfather set up a base camp while his friend went to gather firewood. The weekend they chose to camp turned out to be a humid one, unexpected for the northern climes of Sweden. My granddad described the heat as oppressive, and the humidity drenched their clothes, soaking them to the skin. In the distance, he and Sven heard a rumbling, a few growls of thunder suggestive of an encroaching storm. Camping during an electrical storm was not the safest of activities, particularly surrounded by trees, and my grandfather warned Sven that they should get to the car and wait out the storm. Sven rejected the notion and told my grandfather that their ancestors were a lot tougher and did not need the protection of a car from the elements. Like a true Viking, Sven admonished my grandfather that our ancestors never feared bad weather, but rejoiced in it during their raids at sea. The Vikings could not hide from thunder and lightning in their boats, and if they were fated to die at sea, then it was the will of the gods, as he put it. Bad weather toughened our kin for the battle to follow when our boats hit the shorelines of faraway places. To further convince my grandfather, Sven led him to a clearing, showing my grandfather that the storm was nothing to fear, and that if he looked at the lightning in the distance with a keen eye, he could determine that the flashes were cloud to cloud, and not forks that penetrated the ground. Fork lightning from cloud to ground was dangerous, and given Sven's assessment, the two had nothing to worry about. "Come on, Arvid," said Sven. "You are worried about nothing." My grandfather agreed, choosing to rely on the science of observation, and the two returned to their camp. It was not long before the rumblings moved closer, so close that the two detected ominous vibrations in the soil beneath their feet. Then and there, my grandfather said that from behind a tree, this large orb of blue light materialized and began to expand. An intense heat radiated from it with such ferocity that the nearby trees started to combust. "What is that?" said my grandfather to Sven, pointing at the thing. Sven had a terrified look on his face, a look of recognition, while my grandpa stood paralyzed by the spectacle. Sven made a mad dash to escape, but it was too late. His sudden movement drew the attention of the thing, and it discharged a powerful bolt of lightning that struck Sven in mid-flight. The power of the discharge knocked my grandfather unconscious. When Grandpa woke up, the storm had passed, and his friend Sven lay dead. My grandpa told me he did not want to believe what happened, that it was a bad dream, but when he saw his friend's charred remains several feet away, the image of the blinding electric blue orb came flooding back to his mind. When my grandfather turned Sven over, the body made a crackling sound like crumpling paper, and Sven's limbs broke off like burned stumps of wood. His friend's eyes were melted out of their sockets, and his face stripped of flesh to the bone in places. The ugly specter of his friend remained a persistent image that my grandpa could never forget. A police investigation followed, and an autopsy performed, clearing my grandfather of any suspicions of wrongdoing. The cause of death was marked as lightning strike. That is when my grandpa began to research what exactly it was that killed his friend. He told no one of what he saw for fear of being committed to a mental institution. Under the guise of academic research, he checked with locals to the area of the forest, but they knew nothing. He scoured the computer, finding not a scintilla of data on the electrical entity. Grandpa found his answer in the most unlikely of places, a moldy book that must have been over 100 years old. He found the book at an antiquary shop in Stockholm. The book focused on Norse mythology, and in that book he found information that spoke of an entity capable of generating lightning at will, a creature that took the outline of a human form before it struck. It was said this monstrous thing was created by a cruel and vicious Norse god, though the legend remains unclear which god, as the creature is so old and of uncertain origin that no one really knows. My granddad did not want to believe it, yet he'd witnessed the thing remove his best friend from this world. That is when my granddad's belief in science eroded, and that of superstition began to supplant his Western reasoning, the lines between the two becoming blurred. When my grandfather came to the United States, he never let go of the notion of the lightning man, and decided one day in my single-digit years that it was an important thing for me to know, but never to tell my parents. I accepted the tale as true when I was young, but when I got a little older, my schoolmates chastised me for holding such beliefs, and I soon abandoned them, but not for long. It was during the summer of my 13th year that my grandfather took me fishing on the lake, a regular occurrence that I relished, for he would tell me the wildest tales of the past. It was during the telling of one of those tales when a storm came suddenly upon us. Booms of thunder made their presence known in the distance, and the wind stirred the lake, making rippling waves across the water. For the first time I saw great fear etched in my grandfather's face, an expression of terror I'd never known before, since my grandfather was a brave man in my estimation. He looked at me without uttering a word, went to the outboard motor, pulling fanatically on the starter handle. He pulled several times at an incredible rate of speed, faster than I'd ever seen, but the outboard engine refused to fire. He turned to see the shoreline, and then he stopped cold, letting go the handle. The rope snapped to its neutral position. Our boat rocked from side to side with the ever-increasing turbulence of waves stirred on by incessant gale-force winds. I looked in direction of the shoreline, wondering what lured my grandpa's attention, and there I saw a floating ball of electric blue light hovering over the shoreline sands. It began to roll and skip across the water, headed our way. We were dead in the water, no engine to power us away from this frightful thing. My grandfather stood straight up in the boat and shoved me down. He picked up a paddle and wound up to strike at the thing when I heard a sharp crack and saw blinding white light. They found us after the storm, our boat bumping up against the dock. I was taken to the hospital, my grandfather to the morgue. The medical staff took a statement from me along with law enforcement, and I told them what I saw, the doctors and police attributing my rant to that of a child attempting to explain a lightning strike. They pronounced my grandfather dead at the scene, and the hospital staff refused to acknowledge my story, that he died saving me from the lightning man. I am much older now, in my 50s, but I become like a child again when I hear distant rumbling over the horizon, and right now I hear such rumblings from the same bedroom of my childhood. My parents are deceased, and I am the last of the family lineage, having no siblings and no offspring to carry on the name. I eat and watch from my bedroom window at the advancing storm. The humidity from the day is high again, quite high even for Kentucky, and I know all too well the implications behind the sound of thunder combined with oppressive humidity. I wonder why the lightning man is never spoken of here in the United States, and further wonder if perhaps my grandfather somehow brought the entity with him from Sweden. I do not believe he would conjure or bring such a terrible entity with him by design, or by some insidious intent, nor do I believe that he involved himself with any form of Viking sorcery. But now I own the musty old book of which he spoke that chronicled the etiology of the lightning man. I see a flash off in the distance of the dark blue horizon. I begin to count. It takes a good 20 seconds before I hear the rumble. 4 miles away, according to accepted measurements, I say. I think about my grandpa often, and his science of the old ways, if I may call it a science. My grandpa was a no-nonsense man, but the lightning man remained inexplicable but for the legend. For all his science, it was the old ways that supplanted his rationality when explaining the lightning man, and I agreed. In time, I wondered more whether in fact Thor, the god of thunder, was a real thing. Several more flashes flickered in the distance and detonated with resounding booms, suggestive the storm was getting closer. Even in the distance, no one was safe, as both me and my grandpa discovered in the most intimate of ways. I continue to watch and monitor the storm, counting the time between flashes and the sonic boom of thunder. The interval diminishes to less than 1 second. The next lightning flash strike is uncomfortably close, so close it hits the street light beyond my driveway. The glass lamp explodes spontaneously, extinguishing the light. I duck below my bedroom window, the flash terrifying me. Forks of lightning scatter voltage in every direction, and peals of thunder rattle the very foundations of my ancestral home. The street asphalt beneath the damaged light illuminates again, and in a moment I think that the power came back on, but this was madness because the glass had shattered, rendering the lamp useless. A closer look between the streams of rain rolling down my window pane reveals it was not the street light that now illuminated the road, it was something else. A glowing ball of blue light hovers beneath the smashed lamp, lighting up the scattered broken glass of the street light. It swirls and gives off massive discharges of static electricity like a Tesla coil. It spins on its axis and waits, hunting for movement. I remain frozen to my spot like my grandpa did when he encountered the lightning man in Sweden. Every time lightning flashes across the sky, the lightning man glows ever brighter from the discharges, deriving power from the storm. I watch it move down the street, disappearing from my sight. I decide to stay indoors tonight, even after the storm has long since passed. I open my grandfather's old book, and for the first time begin to read the words of the ancient ones.